The courtroom had never seen anything quite like this. Karen Elizabeth Bradford stood in front of Judge Judy Sheindlin with her chin raised, her finger pointed directly at America's most feared television judge, and her voice echoing through the stunned silence with 4 words that would destroy her life forever. "I know my rights, Judge." The declaration came out like a battle cry, like a challenge, like the confident proclamation of someone who had absolutely no idea they were standing on the edge of a cliff about to be pushed into the most humiliating 12 minutes of their entire existence. The cameras captured every second of her defiant expression, the smug certainty in her eyes, the way she clutched her 3-ring binder like it was a shield that would protect her from what was coming. She had no idea that Judge Judy had been setting a trap from the very first question. She had no idea that every condescending comment, every eye roll, every dismissive gesture had been carefully catalogued by a legal mind that had crushed 20,000 cases before breakfast. And she definitely had no idea that her internet law degree was about to be exposed as worthless in front of millions of viewers who would spend the next week sharing clips of her complete and total destruction across every social media platform imaginable. What makes this story absolutely insane isn't just that Karen lost her case. It's not even that she got embarrassed on national television. What Judge Judy did to her in those 12 minutes was so devastatingly brutal, so surgically precise, so educationally savage that it became the most viral courtroom moment in daytime television history. We're talking about a woman who walked into that courtroom believing she had cracked the code of the legal system through 6 months of Google searches and YouTube videos, only to discover that Judge Judy had been practicing law since before Karen was born. Every article she printed from random legal blogs, every statute she highlighted without understanding, every confident assertion of rights she didn't actually possess was about to be systematically demolished by someone who actually went to law school, passed the bar exam, and spent 25 years as a real judge in Manhattan family court handling actual cases with actual consequences. Karen Bradford thought she was untouchable. At 52 years old, she had spent the better part of a decade perfecting what she called her legal expertise, but what everyone else recognized as the most dangerous combination possible: supreme confidence built on a foundation of complete ignorance. She had successfully bullied customer service workers, intimidated store managers, and extracted refunds and special treatment from restaurants and businesses for years by aggressively shouting about her rights. Every time someone gave in to her demands rather than deal with her tantrum, it reinforced her belief that she understood the law better than the people around her. Every time a minimum wage employee decided it wasn't worth arguing with her, she walked away more convinced that her internet research made her a legal expert. By the time she decided to take her fight to Judge Judy's courtroom, she genuinely believed she was smarter than a woman who had presided over real judicial proceedings for decades. The case seemed simple enough on the surface. Karen was suing her former landlord for what she claimed was an illegal eviction and wrongful retention of her security deposit. She wanted $800 plus damages. But what started as a straightforward tenant dispute had transformed into something much bigger the moment Karen decided she didn't need a lawyer because she had spent months studying landlord-tenant law online. She had filled her binder with printed articles from legal blogs, random statutes she'd found through Google searches, and highlighted passages from court cases she didn't understand. She had posted on social media about how she was going to school Judge Judy on modern legal interpretation and expose the corruption of judges who didn't respect people's rights. She had even practiced her "I know my rights" speech in front of her bathroom mirror, perfecting the tone of righteous indignation that she believed would make her look powerful and knowledgeable on camera. What Karen didn't know was that Judge Judy's research team had reviewed her paperwork before the show and immediately spotted 17 different legal errors and misunderstandings. What she didn't know was that Judge Judy had seen her social media posts bragging about embarrassing the judge on national television. What she didn't know was that Judge Judy had spent the previous evening reviewing actual case law and preparing what legal scholars would later call the most educational takedown in courtroom television history. Karen Bradford had walked into that courtroom thinking she was about to have her moment of glory, her chance to prove that ordinary people with internet access could outsmart the system. Instead, she was about to learn the most painful lesson of her life, and millions of people were going to watch her learn it while crying uncontrollably on national television. Karen Elizabeth Bradford wasn't born an entitled nightmare who terrorized service workers and confused Google searches with legal education. But by the time she reached her early 50s, she had perfected the art of weaponizing partial knowledge and supreme confidence into a lifestyle of getting exactly what she wanted through sheer aggressive persistence. Her transformation into the woman who would eventually humiliate herself on national television had been years in the making, built on a foundation of small victories over people who simply didn't have the energy to fight back against her relentless assertion of rights she didn't actually understand. She had started small, like most people who eventually become monsters of entitlement. A complaint here about a restaurant meal that resulted in a free dessert. A demand there for a manager who gave her a discount just to make her go away. Each successful intimidation reinforced the neural pathways that told her she was smarter than everyone else, that her interpretation of fairness and legality mattered more than actual rules and regulations. The real turning point in Karen's journey toward courtroom humiliation came about 6 years before her fateful appearance on Judge Judy. She had been fired from her job as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized insurance company, and instead of accepting responsibility for her chronic lateness and confrontational attitude toward coworkers, she decided the termination was illegal and began researching employment law online. She spent hours on legal advice forums, reading blog posts written by people with no legal credentials, and convincing herself that she had discovered violations that even her former employer's lawyers had missed. She drafted a demand letter using legal terminology she barely understood, filled with threats of lawsuits and citations of statutes that didn't actually apply to her situation. The insurance company, wanting to avoid even the nuisance of dealing with her, offered her a small settlement that she immediately interpreted as proof that she had been right all along. She hadn't been right. They had just decided that $3,000 was cheaper than having their HR department waste time responding to her nonsense. But in Karen's mind, she had just won her first legal victory, and it was intoxicating. From that moment forward, Karen threw herself into what she called her legal education with the obsessive focus that more reasonable people might apply to actual hobbies or productive pursuits. She subscribed to legal YouTube channels run by disbarred attorneys and law school dropouts. She joined online forums where people who had never passed a bar exam gave each other advice about how to represent themselves in court. She printed hundreds of pages of court decisions that she found through random Google searches, highlighting passages that sounded authoritative without understanding the context or whether the cases had been overturned on appeal. Her home office became a shrine to pseudo-legal expertise, with filing cabinets full of articles from blogs with names like knowyourrightsnow.com and selfrepresentationsuccess.org. She started referring to herself in social media posts as a legal researcher and citizen advocate. Her Facebook profile picture showed her sitting at a desk surrounded by law books she had never actually read, trying to project an image of scholarly authority that existed only in her imagination. The landlord dispute that would eventually bring Karen to Judge Judy's courtroom started as most tenant conflicts do, with a misunderstanding about lease terms and cleaning standards that could have been resolved through basic communication and common sense. Karen had rented a small apartment in a suburban complex for 18 months, and when she decided to move out, her landlord had deducted $250 from her $800 security deposit for carpet cleaning and repairs to walls where she had hung decorations without permission. A reasonable person might have been annoyed but would have recognized that the deductions were explicitly allowed in the lease agreement they had signed. Karen, however, saw this as an opportunity to deploy her accumulated legal knowledge in a real-world scenario. She immediately fired off a letter to her former landlord claiming the deductions were illegal under state tenant protection laws, citing 3 different statutes that she had completely misunderstood. When the landlord politely explained that the lease agreement clearly outlined these potential deductions and that they were well within legal bounds, Karen interpreted this response as evidence that she was being taken advantage of by someone who hoped she didn't know her rights. Over the next 4 months, Karen escalated her demands from the original $250 to $800 for the full security deposit, plus an additional $2,000 for what she claimed was emotional distress and harassment. She sent weekly letters filled with legal terminology copied from internet sources. She filed complaints with the local housing authority that were dismissed because they had no merit. She left negative reviews on every platform she could find, not just criticizing the apartment complex but specifically claiming that the landlord was violating federal housing regulations. She became so consumed with this fight that it took over her life, with her spending hours each day researching new legal theories and drafting increasingly aggressive demands. When her former landlord finally stopped responding to her letters entirely, Karen made the decision that would change everything. She was going to take this fight to television court, specifically to Judge Judy, because she wanted a platform to expose what she believed was systematic corruption in the landlord-tenant system. She filled out the application for the show with confidence bordering on delusion, actually writing in her submission that she was excited to educate Judge Judy about modern tenant rights law. The producers, recognizing immediately that they had found television gold in the form of a completely delusional pseudo-legal expert, accepted her case within days. Karen Bradford had made the single worst mistake possible when selecting her target for legal combat. She had somehow convinced herself that daytime television judges were just actors reading scripts, that their authority was purely theatrical, and that someone with her level of internet research could easily expose the performance for what she believed it to be. What Karen didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly have comprehended through her fog of delusional confidence, was that Judge Judy Scheindlin represented everything her fake expertise wasn't. While Karen had spent 6 years reading blog posts and watching YouTube videos, Judge Judy had spent 25 years as a family court judge in Manhattan, one of the busiest and most challenging judicial assignments in the entire American legal system. She had presided over more than 20,000 actual cases involving real people with real problems and real legal consequences. She had seen every type of liar, every variety of scammer, and every breed of person who thought they could manipulate the system through confidence and aggression. She had developed what legal scholars called an almost supernatural ability to identify frauds and fools within the first 30 seconds of meeting them, and she had built her television career on the foundation of that hard-earned judicial expertise. Judge Judy hadn't become America's highest-paid television personality by being soft on people who disrespected the law or who thought arrogance could substitute for actual knowledge. She had earned her reputation through decades of holding people accountable with a combination of legal precision and devastating directness that left no room for excuses or manipulation. When her producers brought her Karen's case file, she had recognized immediately what she was dealing with. The paperwork was filled with legal citations that were either completely irrelevant to tenant law or were taken so far out of context that they meant the opposite of what Karen thought they meant. The demand letter Karen had submitted referenced constitutional rights that had nothing to do with security deposits, confused state statutes with federal regulations, and quoted from court cases that had been overturned years ago. Judge Judy's research team had compiled a devastating file on Karen's complete lack of legal understanding, but Judge Judy had decided to do something more valuable than simply ruling against her. She was going to use this case to teach millions of viewers what real law looked like, and she was going to do it by systematically dismantling every false claim Karen made until there was nothing left but tears and humiliation. The courtroom atmosphere that morning was electric with anticipation. Karen had arrived 2 hours early, her 3-ring binder clutched protectively against her chest like a talisman that would ward off any criticism of her preparation. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue suit that she thought made her look professional and authoritative, paired with reading glasses that she hoped would make her appear scholarly and serious. She had spent the waiting time flipping through her binder, reviewing her highlighted passages and practicing her key phrases under her breath. When she finally walked into the courtroom and took her place at the defendant's table, her confidence was so absolute that it bordered on manic. She made direct eye contact with the cameras, already imagining how she would look to the millions of viewers she assumed would be impressed by her legal knowledge. She arranged her binder on the table with deliberate care, making sure the thickness of her research was visible to everyone in the room. She even allowed herself a small smile when Judge Judy entered, completely misreading the situation and believing that the judge's professional demeanor meant she hadn't yet realized who she was dealing with. Judge Judy's opening was deceptively simple and straightforward, exactly as she had planned it. "Ms. Bradford, you're suing your former landlord for $800 claiming illegal deduction of your security deposit, is that correct?" Karen's response was immediate and revealed everything wrong with her approach in just a few sentences. "Yes, Your Honor, that's correct, and I'm also seeking additional damages for the illegal harassment I endured when I tried to assert my rights as a tenant under state and federal protection statutes." She delivered these words with the kind of practiced confidence that came from months of rehearsal, her voice carrying just enough righteous indignation to suggest that she was the victim of a grave injustice. Judge Judy's eyebrow raised slightly, a warning sign that experienced viewers of her show recognized immediately as the beginning of something devastating, but Karen was too focused on her performance to notice the danger she was already in. The questions continued, each one simple and direct, each one designed to let Karen dig her hole deeper. "Can you explain which specific statutes you believe were violated?" Judge Judy asked, her tone still professional and measured. Karen eagerly flipped open her binder to a page she had marked with multiple colored tabs, clearly excited to demonstrate her research. "According to my extensive legal research, Your Honor, the landlord violated Title VIII of the Fair Housing Act, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and multiple state consumer protection statutes that prohibit predatory practices against vulnerable tenants." She read these citations with the kind of confidence that would have been impressive if any of them had actually applied to her situation. The Fair Housing Act dealt with discrimination in housing, not security deposit disputes. The 14th Amendment applied to government action, not private landlord-tenant relationships. And the consumer protection statutes she referenced were designed for entirely different types of commercial transactions. But Karen had found these impressive-sounding legal terms through her Google searches, and she had convinced herself that stringing them together made her sound knowledgeable and authoritative. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair slightly, that subtle movement that regular viewers knew meant she was about to destroy someone's entire argument. Ms. Bradford, do you understand what the Fair Housing Act actually covers? The question seemed innocent enough, almost curious, but it was actually the first carefully placed explosive in what would become a systematic demolition of everything Karen thought she knew about law. Karen's response to Judge Judy's question about the Fair Housing Act revealed the fatal flaw in her entire approach to legal knowledge. Of course I understand it, Your Honor. It protects tenants from illegal actions by landlords, which is exactly what happened in my case. She delivered this answer with the kind of exasperated confidence that suggested she couldn't believe she was being asked such a basic question, as if Judge Judy was the one who needed education about fundamental legal principles. The courtroom audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something terrible was about to happen but not yet understanding the full scope of the destruction Judge Judy was preparing to unleash. Karen, completely oblivious to the volcanic eruption building behind Judge Judy's controlled exterior, actually went further and added with a dismissive wave of her hand, I know my rights, Judge, and I know when they've been violated. Those 6 words, delivered with such absolute certainty, became the trigger that released Judge Judy's full arsenal of judicial authority and legal expertise. Judge Judy's voice dropped to that dangerously quiet tone that made seasoned attorneys break out in cold sweats and caused defendants to suddenly remember they had somewhere else they needed to be. Ms. Bradford, let me educate you about what the Fair Housing Act actually covers, since you clearly have no idea despite your claims of extensive legal research. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. It has absolutely nothing to do with security deposit disputes between landlords and tenants. Nothing. Zero. You have cited a federal civil rights law in a case about carpet cleaning and wall repairs. She paused to let that devastating truth sink in, watching as the first cracks appeared in Karen's confident facade. The audience gasped audibly as they realized they were witnessing not just a legal ruling but a complete educational dismantling of someone who had confused internet searches with actual knowledge. Karen's face went through a rapid color transformation from confident pink to confused pale to defensive red as she frantically flipped through her binder looking for support that didn't exist. But Your Honor, I read multiple articles that said tenants have rights under this act, she stammered, her voice losing its earlier authority and taking on a desperate edge that betrayed her growing panic. Judge Judy was merciless in her response, leaning forward with the expression that meant someone was about to be professionally destroyed on national television. You read articles written by people who don't understand the law any better than you do, Ms. Bradford. And that's the problem with thinking Google makes you a lawyer. You've spent months collecting garbage from unreliable sources and convincing yourself it's legal expertise. Judge Judy then reached for Karen's binder, and what happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media as the perfect example of what happens when fake expertise meets real authority. Judge Judy picked up the binder and began going through it page by page with the systematic precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, except in this case the tumor was Karen's entire sense of intellectual superiority. This article from legaladviceforeveryone.com was written by someone who was disbarred in 2 states for incompetence. This blog post you've highlighted is from a website that doesn't even list author credentials because they don't have any. This court case you've cited so prominently was overturned on appeal 3 years ago and is no longer valid precedent, which you would know if you had access to actual legal research databases instead of just Google searches. With each revelation, Karen's binder transformed from her shield of confidence into evidence of her complete ignorance, and her face showed the dawning horror of someone realizing they had just humiliated themselves on national television in front of millions of viewers who would never let her forget this moment. But Judge Judy wasn't finished with her devastating education. She moved on to Karen's citation of the 14th Amendment, and her voice carried the weight of decades of actual judicial experience crushing the delusions of a woman who had thought watching YouTube videos made her a constitutional scholar. Ms. Bradford, you've claimed your landlord violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Do you even know what that amendment requires? Karen tried to respond but her voice came out as a weak whisper that the microphones barely picked up. It protects people from being treated unfairly. Judge Judy's response was swift and brutal. The 14th Amendment applies to state action, Ms. Bradford. State action. It restricts what the government can do, not what private landlords can do in civil disputes. Your landlord is not the government. This is not a constitutional case. You have cited one of the most important amendments in American history in a situation where it has absolutely no application whatsoever. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete and total exposure of intellectual fraud happening in real time with no possibility of recovery or redemption. Karen's hands were visibly shaking now as she desperately tried to find something in her binder that Judge Judy hadn't already destroyed, some article or citation that would prove she wasn't completely ignorant about everything she had claimed to understand. "But Your Honor, I spent months researching this case," she pleaded, her voice cracking with the first hints of tears that would soon flow freely. "I know my rights. I know what the law says." Judge Judy's final blow was delivered with the devastating precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "No, Ms. Bradford, you don't know your rights. You don't know what the law says. You know what random internet strangers told you the law says. You have confused confidence with competence, and you have wasted this court's time with legal claims that have no basis in actual law. And now you're going to learn what happens when someone who thinks they're a legal expert meets someone who actually is one." The transformation that occurred in Karen Bradford over the next several minutes was so complete, so utterly devastating, that it redefined what millions of viewers understood about the consequences of arrogance meeting expertise. The woman who had strutted into the courtroom with her binder held high like a weapon, who had pointed her finger at Judge Judy and declared her knowledge of rights she didn't understand, who had posted on social media about schooling a television judge on real law, was about to experience the most humiliating emotional collapse ever captured on daytime television. Judge Judy wasn't just ruling against her. She was systematically dismantling every false belief that had allowed Karen to terrorize service workers and intimidate people who didn't have the knowledge or authority to fight back against her aggressive assertions of fake legal expertise. The cameras captured every second of Karen's disintegration, from the moment her confident expression cracked into confusion, then panic, then finally desperate tears that would be shared across every social media platform as a cautionary tale about what happens when you confuse Google searches with actual education. Judge Judy continued her devastating legal education with the relentless precision of someone who had spent 25 years dealing with people exactly like Karen, people who thought volume and confidence could substitute for actual knowledge, people who had successfully bullied their way through life until they finally encountered someone who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. "Ms. Bradford, let me explain something to you that you clearly don't understand despite your months of so-called research. The law is not a collection of impressive-sounding phrases you can throw around to get what you want. It's a complex system that requires years of study, practical application, and genuine understanding of how different statutes, regulations, and precedents interact with each other. You have demonstrated today that you possess none of that understanding. You have cited laws that don't apply to your situation. You have referenced court cases you clearly never read beyond finding them in a Google search. You have confused constitutional protections with contract law, federal discrimination statutes with state tenant regulations, and basic legal terminology with actual legal arguments." Her voice rose with each point, building to a crescendo that echoed through the courtroom like thunder, and Karen's face showed the progression of someone's entire worldview collapsing in real time. The tears started slowly, just a shimmer in Karen's eyes that she tried desperately to blink away because crying would mean admitting she was wrong, and her entire identity for the past 6 years had been built on the foundation of being the one person in every room who actually understood how things worked. But as Judge Judy continued laying out the systematic destruction of every legal claim Karen had made, the tears came faster and harder until mascara was running down her cheeks in dark streams that made her look like a melting wax figure of her former confident self. "Your Honor, please," Karen sobbed, her voice stripped of all its earlier authority and reduced to the desperate pleading of someone who had just realized the full scope of their public humiliation. "I thought I was right. I spent so much time researching. I really believed I understood the law." The admission came out between gasping breaths as years of false confidence crumbled into the crushing weight of reality, and the courtroom audience watched in fascinated horror as the same woman who had been lecturing Judge Judy about legal interpretation 20 minutes earlier was now begging for mercy like a child who had been caught in a lie. Judge Judy's response contained no sympathy, no softening of her devastating assessment, because she understood that Karen needed to learn this lesson in the most painful way possible or she would walk out of this courtroom and continue terrorizing people who couldn't fight back against her aggressive ignorance. "You thought you were right because you surrounded yourself with other people who don't understand the law, Ms. Bradford. You spent months reading articles written by people who failed the bar exam, watching videos made by disbarred attorneys, and convincing yourself that this constituted legal education. You joined online forums where people who have never set foot in a law school gave each other advice about how to represent themselves in court. And you became so confident in your false knowledge that you actually believed you could come into my courtroom and lecture me about legal interpretation. Me. Someone who spent 3 years in law school, passed one of the hardest bar exams in the country, and presided over 20,000 real cases with real legal consequences. The comparison was brutal and undeniable, and Karen's sobbing intensified as she was forced to confront the gap between her imagined expertise and Judge Judy's actual lifetime of legal achievement. The ruling itself was swift and merciless, delivered with the finality of a guillotine blade ending any hope Karen might have harbored that she could somehow salvage something from this disaster. I find in favor of the plaintiff, the landlord, on all counts. The security deposit deductions were legal, proper, and clearly outlined in the lease agreement that you signed. You have no case under the Fair Housing Act because that law doesn't apply to your situation. You have no constitutional claim because the 14th Amendment doesn't govern private landlord-tenant disputes. You have no basis for emotional distress damages because being held accountable for damage you caused to someone else's property is not harassment. Furthermore, I am awarding court costs to the defendant in the amount of $2,500 because you have wasted this court's time with frivolous legal claims based on research you didn't understand. You will pay a total of $3,300, and you will do it while remembering that the next time you want to tell someone you know your rights, you should actually take the time to learn what those rights are. The gavel came down with explosive finality, and Karen's breakdown reached its peak as she realized she hadn't just lost her case, she had lost it so spectacularly that she would forever be remembered as the woman who thought Google made her a lawyer. The bailiff had to physically assist Karen out of the courtroom because she was crying so hard she could barely stand, her designer suit now rumpled and stained with tears, her carefully styled hair disheveled from running her hands through it in distress, her expensive binder full of useless research left scattered across the defendant's table like the debris of a demolished building. The landlord, a quiet middle-aged man who had simply wanted his legitimate cleaning costs reimbursed, sat in stunned relief as he realized that justice had been served in the most comprehensive way possible. The audience erupted in applause, not just for the ruling but for the educational masterclass they had just witnessed, for Judge Judy's systematic dismantling of entitled ignorance, for the clear demonstration that real expertise matters and fake knowledge has consequences. Within hours of the episode airing, the clip exploded across social media with a virality that exceeded even the most dramatic Judge Judy moments from previous years. The hashtag #IKnowMyRights began trending worldwide as millions of people shared the video with captions like "This is what happens when you confuse Google with law school and the moment fake expertise met real authority." Legal professionals shared the clip in bar association groups, praising Judge Judy's patient but devastating education about the difference between actual legal knowledge and internet research. Law schools added the footage to their professional responsibility courses as an example of why representing yourself without proper legal training can lead to catastrophic results. Karen's name became synonymous with the dangers of overconfidence built on a foundation of ignorance, and her tear-stained face became a meme representing everyone who had ever thought they knew more than actual experts in any field. The broader impact of Karen's humiliation extended far beyond social media entertainment. Customer service workers across the country reported feeling vindicated as they watched someone who embodied every difficult customer they had ever dealt with finally face consequences for her aggressive assertions of rights she didn't understand. Managers shared the clip in training sessions about how to handle customers who claim legal violations without basis. Landlords used the footage to educate tenants about the actual laws governing security deposits versus the misinformation spread on internet forums. And perhaps most importantly, millions of people who had been tempted to represent themselves in legal matters after doing some online research reconsidered their plans and decided that maybe actual attorneys existed for a reason. Karen Bradford had wanted to become famous for exposing judicial corruption and educating America about tenant rights. Instead, she became the most memorable example in television history of why confidence without competence is not just embarrassing but potentially financially devastating. Judge Judy had delivered more than a legal ruling that day. She had given the world a masterclass in why expertise matters, why real education cannot be replaced by internet searches, and why the 4 words "I know my rights" mean absolutely nothing if you don't actually know your rights.